Good morning. My name is Maria Levis, and my mentors are, Diana Dolmans and Renee Stalsmeyer. Today I'm going to be presenting to you my proposal to study the understanding of how organizational conditions enable interprofessional collaborative practice in primary care settings. So first, a little about me. So I come from Puerto Rico, which is a little island in the Caribbean, which is part of the U.S. It's a territory, and it's located between Florida and South America. I started my studies when I was 16 at the College of William and Mary, which is the oldest educational institution in the United States. And that was the first time that I came into contact with racism against me as a Latina. And that prompted a lot of conviction around disparities, particularly health disparities. So I spent the next 10 years in Puerto Rico in a nonprofit where I fell in love with healthcare. And I decided that I needed to go back to school, and I studied at Harvard to improve my expertise in health policy and health management. So for the last 10 years, I've been working not just in Puerto Rico, but also in the United States, working with federally qualified health centers, which are community health centers that work in the most impoverished communities to improve the quality of care. Specifically, I have been working with a model called patient-centered medical home, which is a focus on team-based care. And you can see some of the people participating in the sessions. Now, hopefully, at Maastricht University, understanding how we can implement that successfully. So the problem that we are addressing in these studies are, first, there's a lot of evidence on why interprofessional collaborative practice makes primary care settings more safe and is better for treating particularly chronic disease patients. But there seems to be a disconnect between interprofessional education and efforts to educate professionals in team practices and effective interprofessional collaborative practice. So even though there is more education, that's not necessarily translating to interprofessional collaborative practice. Now, there's a lot of research that has been going on lately, which seems to indicate that organizational conditions and context are a mediating factor between the education and what is happening in the practice. So before I go into the focus of the studies, which is the focus on the organizational conditions, I want to explain what in this study we're going to be focusing on with respect to interprofessional collaborative practice. So what is interprofessional collaborative practice? According to the World Health Organization, it's not just about team-based care. So the first piece is health workers with different professional backgrounds working together to provide comprehensive services. It's also about their capacity to deliver the highest quality of care across a setting. So it's not just about teams, it's about teams performing with high quality. In order to operationalize this in our studies, in our settings, for healthcare teams, we will be focusing on organizations that are recognized as patient-centered medical home, which, as I mentioned, is a team-based care model. In order to focus on organizations that are able to deliver the highest quality results, we will be looking at community health centers, which have been able to rate in the top 5% for managing diabetes. The reason we'll be looking at diabetes is, one, diabetes is an area where we know that interprofessional education has a high impact. And second, it is also an area that is very well measured with respect to performance. So there's a lot of metrics that we can look at. So when we are talking in this study about interprofessional collaborative practice, we will not look at everything. We will be looking specifically at team performance. So what is the gap? So a recent systematic review identified that the understanding of organizational conditions is an important area that needs to be looked at as to why education is not translating to interprofessional collaborative practice. So while there is a lot of discussion on this topic, this concept of what the organizational conditions or what the organizational context is has not been well defined. And that's what we're going to be looking at. We identified activity theory as a good way of helping put together this very broad and abstract concept into something that is more tangible and easier to measure. So in activity theory, there is an individual or a subject or a learner who has a motive that drives some outcomes. In our studies, it'll be improved patient diabetes control. Now, that individual operates within a context composed of tools, norms, community, and division of labor. Now, the interesting thing about activity theory for this research is that we can look at it in the individual, but organizations are more complex than that. So we can look at it at the team level. And there we start to see how different team members or learners might have different perceptions on all of the issues, particularly on their object, which impacts then the outcome, right? But organizations are even more complex than that. And the nice thing about activity theory is that we can look at it from the organizational level. So we can also look at how management, vis-a-vis the teams, see what should be happening within the organizational concept and context and conditions. So these are our research questions. We're going to start with a question about what is known in the scientific literature about how organizational conditions enable or inhibit the adoption of interprofessional collaboration in primary care settings. We will use that information for our next study, in which we will look at the perceptions of primary care teams, specifically nurses, physicians, and support staff, who have been able to demonstrate effective interprofessional collaborative practice, how they perceive and define their organizational conditions. We will use that then to further look into how or what organizational conditions can actually be found. So one thing is their perception from the team setting, and then what can be found in the practices, both from the perspective of managers and the primary care teams. And finally, we will use that information to identify what a tool that would help teams identify and address these organizational conditions to stimulate interprofessional collaborative practice would look like. The studies that we have structured, we've structured 4 studies. The first, as you heard, focuses on synthesis of what is known, and we'll do that through a scoping review. The next 2 will look at exploring current practice in practices that have already been successful in implementing and delivering results. And the first study will use constructivist grounded theory to establish a model from the perspective of the team members. A lot of this is because, we're putting together the concept so that we can organize it better. That will help us with our second study, in which we will use a multiple case study design, and it will be of a more observational nature, so that we can look at what are the conditions that are actually found at these practices vis-a-vis the perceptions that we identified in the second study. And in the final study, we will use design-based research to develop a tool that helps teams to identify and address organizational conditions that stimulate interprofessional collaborative practice. That is what we have come up with so far. I will leave you with one thought, and it's by Eduardo Salas, who is well known for his work in teamwork. And in his most recent review on this topic, he said, "No transformation of healthcare will be complete without understanding the organizational conditions that lead to effective and sustainable transfer in health systems." So I look forward to working with you and answering these questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria.